Welcome to the Habibie Center's Talking ASEAN, a series of discussions that we have to talk about and discuss ASEAN issues. Welcome back for those of you who's not here for the first time, and welcome to those first timers to Talking ASEAN. We promise that you'll want to come back for others, but we have a really special panel today, one coming from very far, Professor Juergen Rueland, who is from the Freiburg Institute of Asian Studies in Freiburg. He's currently the chairperson of the Freiburg University Southeast Asia program, and the title of the topic that we have given is ASEAN as an actor in international forums, reality, potential and constraints, is actually the name of the research project, which has been completed by Professor Rueland and is due to be launched. Very excited, and will be ready next month. So will we see you next month here? No?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
The term
Here's
is
to wishing.
Unfortunately.
But his research interests include democratization, political, economic, social, and cultural change in Southeast Asia. His current study is on Indonesia's foreign policy. I will let him tell you all about that, because that's another exciting project, which I've now already tapped, hopefully to be launched in Jakarta. In addition to Professor Rueland, we're very, very fortunate to have two distinguished gentlemen on my right and on the far left. Mr. Andreas List, as the Senior Coordinator for ASEAN Delegation of the European Union to Indonesia, Brunei, and ASEAN. He worked previously as the head of the EU office in Yangon, and his key interests are politics, economics, social issues, Southeast Asia, EU policies. This list actually can go on, because I've spoken to Andreas and he can speak about a lot of things, which is really good. Batik. You should have worn your batik. And on my right, of course, is Mr. Juergen, the Director of ASEAN Functional Cooperation from our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So what's going to happen is I'm going to stop talking soon, and I'm going to give the floor to Professor Rueland to tell you more about the book that's going to be launched next month, and for about 20 minutes. And then I'm going to give Andreas and George a chance to contradict, disagree, and just basically, I don't know, this is not a Viva. Thank God, I was going to have flashbacks as well. Yes, I will give now the floor to Professor Rueland. You can sit here, or you're allowed to roam, stand up?
No, I think it's fine.
All right, okay.
How does the PowerPoint work? Is somebody in charge of it?
Where, yeah. There.
Okay.
So you can just nudge to, wink to him, or...
Okay, Ima, thanks very much for this kind introduction, and I'm really looking forward to that discussion this afternoon. It's my first time to give a presentation in the Habibie Center, and that's also something which I enjoy personally very much. The talk that I'm supposed to give today is, as Ima already mentioned, the result of a research project that was organized by the National University of Singapore, and the title was Integration Through Law. We just talked a bit about that. The idea was how to make ASEAN a more rules-based, more legalized regional organization than it was in the past, and the ASEAN Charter was seen as a major signal to go ahead with that. And I did that study together with a Thai colleague, Parvati Mudragun from Chiang Mai University, we were asked to do precisely this topic that you see in front of you. Now, briefly, what I'm going to talk about, I think not all of you are university scholars or think tank scholars. I will therefore limit my talk about the theoretical framework, but I have to say a little bit about that in order to make the further presentation understandable. I will talk then about ASEAN in two major international forums. That means basically global multilateral forums, the UN General Assembly and the WTO. This were our major examples for this study, and I hope to be able to conclude, although I must admit already at that point that I will present no major spectacular recommendation, because this is really incremental work, and this somehow needs also to be recognized. Just for the next two or three, the puzzle, the research question that we basically touched upon is how does ASEAN operate in global forums, how cohesive is ASEAN in these forums, and which factors shape ASEAN's behavior in global forums. We have a few basic theoretical assumptions. I come back to that now, although we realized that this was a topic which was really tabula rasa. There was no research about it. We had really to start from scratch and looking into theoretical work that has been done on the behavior of regional organization in global multilateral forums. We found out that there was a bit of research which basically argued that the more regional organizations integrate, the deeper they integrate, the more cohesive they also become vis-à-vis third states. This is what we call in the theoretical literature the so-called externalization theories. Regional organizations reduplicate practically the behavior they practice within the organization. We did not really disagree with that, but we said less than usually the factors that were taken into account in that theory, which is functional specificity, homogeneity, having an autonomous central authority. That's not enough. I mean, the hypothesis usually was the more functional, specific, or less policy fields and regional organization is covering, the more homogeneous its members, the more it has a sort of an overarching, perhaps even supranational authority, the more it is cohesive and also exports that cohesiveness outside. And so that is something to a certain extent we agreed, but we said that's not enough. In order to understand how a regional organization operates outside its organization, is to look at cognitive factors, the way political players interpreted the past. What experience has a country made in the past? Historical experience. What about the neighborhood? In what circumstances does the regional organization operate? That's much more important and also strongly influences the institutional setup, because if there is a high level of distrust, for instance, just to name an example, then it is also not very probable and very likely that there is a lot of cohesiveness when it comes to global forums. We say that these cognitive factors result in constraints for ASEAN in global forums in that way that they shape the repository of cooperation norms, which is the ASEAN way, as you know, the institutional setup, which is very strongly based on intergovernmental concepts and sovereignty, and we also argued that these constraints have even exacerbated, that might be surprising perhaps, due to the conflicting norms that have been brought into the ASEAN way with the Bali Concord too, which also strongly emphasizes democracy, human rights, good governance, and so on. This conflicts with the previous value basis. And ASEAN also has to struggle with the power asymmetries that usually characterize international organizations. A final point, in order to measure somehow how ASEAN acts in international organizations, we developed a typology of actor cohesion based on on several properties, which range from block type behavior to bowling alone. The last two, block and bowling alone, are ideal types. You wouldn't probably find them in reality, so you have more to concentrate on the continuum and the middle of that continuum, which is quasi-block behavior and caucus type behavior. We then looked into first what makes ASEAN tick, what normative, what cognitive factors play a role in the thinking of decision makers in ASEAN, and we went way back in terms of ideational history and said that this is a region where you always had experienced major turbulences in the international politics, in the interstate or inter-empire relations, and therefore it is also very comprehensible that in this region ideas that you could closely align with political realism have been there for a long period of time. Some of you might know the Arthashastra, which was imported to Javanese and pre-colonial codes in Indonesia, and this thinking shaped very much pre-colonial thinking, but that was then reproduced permanently through colonial experiences of conquest, of great power intervention, to a highly asymmetric global distribution of power, a history of disputes in the region itself. And so it is very understandable that decision makers in the region operated on a basis that they considered their survival of the nation state, of their political entity as essential and prone to vulnerabilities throughout, and therefore very well captured in the Indonesian concept of ketahanan nasional, national resilience, that every nation should be able to save and care for its survival. Then in the next step we looked into the material capacities of ASEAN as an international negotiator. Two things are important for that. In order to negotiate successfully, you must have a certain infrastructure, knowledge infrastructure nationally, but you also must have one regionally. Nationally, of course, ASEAN has built up these missions in New York and Geneva, which coordinate the negotiations that are on the table. These are staffed in a very different way that shows again ASEAN's diversity. For instance, Indonesia and also the Philippines have a relatively larger staff, some 25 people. Just to give you a comparison, Germany has about 75, the US has 175 diplomats working in its mission. So that also indicates already some of the work capacity that can be taken on by these missions. You need, as policy matters become increasingly complex, technical, also a lot of know-how which these missions on the spot might not have, and the practical solution to that was usually to second or bring in experts from national ministry, the government, but that is also important, not necessarily experts from the private sector, corporate lawyers, for instance, or even NGO persons. Most missions really worked on the basis of knowledge that they got through their governments. And in this sense, we also checked in the project what is the basis for extra-governmental sources of knowledge, and we looked into think tanks, media, NGOs, and so on. And to make it short, I think the picture is very diverse. Singapore, of course, with a very high economic development, can afford to spend much more than Laos or Myanmar can spend, and that makes also the knowledge base very diverse, and also internal coordination difficult, because if you don't know what the effect of a certain solution is, then you might be hesitant to support a certain point that is proposed collectively. We also looked at the regional negotiation capacity. What comes into mind there first is the ASEAN Secretariat. We looked into the issue to what extent ASEAN's Secretariat can adopt catalyst functions in knowledge management. Can they provide sources, access to centers of knowledge that might be important for solution of international issues under negotiation. You might not be surprised, we said that the resources of the ASEAN Secretariat are not sufficient budgetary wise. I think we'll probably discuss that later on in terms of staffing. You have these committees that I have mentioned already. Sometimes they work well, sometimes they do not work so well. It depends really who is in charge, who is the presidency, the leadership of these committees that decides about the ambition, the level of ambition these committees pursue. We have found several instances where ASEAN prepared major meetings beforehand in the region. Indonesia, for instance, during its presidency in 2011, established a contract group to prepare the G20 meetings. Although I've not heard since then, I think they met once under Indonesian leadership, but maybe the colleague from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs can say something about that. Universities, ASEAN ISIS provide some knowledge, less in the university network that still needs to be developed further. ASEAN ISIS depends. The ASEAN Original Five have relatively highly developed research institutions, not so much the new members, and also a relatively ambiguous picture emerges when you look at the regional business groups and the regional NGO networks, which have been better integrated into coordination and cooperation with ASEAN at the ASEAN level, but it's still contested as to what extent NGOs should be a regular part of the consultation and the consultation and decision-making process. Not so much at the level of the Indonesian government, which has gone relatively far in that, but not all other members agree integrating NGOs. I briefly summarize some of our findings in the literature on international negotiations. You can identify very roughly certain steps. The first stage where you identify problems, where you define the issues, and where the agenda setting plays a major role. The second stage, when you have agreed on that, you must find norms, rules, procedures, how you negotiate and how you cooperate, and finally the concluding stage, the voting, and to what extent compliance can be ascertained in these decisions that are then made. Looking at that, I briefly summarize how we see ASEAN as an agenda set up as a regional organization that as a collective entity sets agendas in a global forum. We certainly found a number of issues where ASEAN became a leader, but generally these were what you call low politics, minor, special, very special issues, but not when it comes to major global problems like UN reform, like climate change, or I don't know, nuclear disarmament. In these cases, ASEAN was mainly a reactive force, and just to mention that we looked at UN reform in greater depth. We could find, of course, that there is a formula compromise among ASEAN members what should be changed in the UN system, but when you look deeper, you find considerable discrepancies in the ideas of ASEAN membership, ranging from Indonesia, which at one point in the last decade even proposed to be a member of the permanent member of the Security Council, and on the other hand Singapore, which says that small states usually are totally overlooked in the UN reform agenda, and therefore small states must have a major voice. Things like that, and many others that you could find. Looking at the second stage, how does ASEAN act in terms of a norm entrepreneur? Does it create new norms in international organizations? You all know that ASEAN was very successful in shaping the norms in the region and the wider Asia-Pacific region. It's exported its ASEAN way to many other meetings in the region. Even the EU, ASEAN and ASEM meeting more or less met on the basis of what ASEAN proposed the norms should be. But looking at international, global organization, we find that ASEAN pursues a rather conservative stand, basically proposing Westphalian sovereignty norms when it comes to behind the border effects of norms. For instance, in the R2P norm, it is relatively reluctant and shows a lot of reservation regarding changes in that area. Also, ASEAN also has consented to R2P in the 2005 summit at the UN. On the other hand, ASEAN is also not a radical challenger of the international institutional architecture. ASEAN criticizes many procedures, many norms, many ways of defining membership of international organizations, and it explicitly says that international global institutions are elitist, are protectionist, are exclusivist, and are basically shaped by Western countries many decades ago, and this certainly must change. On the other hand, it is also not one of those powers who are radically challenging the international structure. It works in it, but it seeks an incremental change and incremental reform of it, and this also means that you find relatively little obstructive, intransigent negotiation practices. ASEAN always takes a lot of concern for being considered as a good global citizen, and works constructively in these bodies. And finally, the last stage, voting and decision-making global forums. This is a very interesting case, and probably will get a lot of flack with our assessment of that, because if you look, for instance, at the General Assembly voting, you see that, at least based on empirical quantitative studies, obviously ASEAN has a very high consent, more than 90%, even higher than the EU in some years. But we challenged this figure. We said, first of all, this does not say much, because 90% of the decisions at the EU are common sense, are not really contested. And if you look at those that are contested, the picture starts to change. And we also looked at the figures. Usually the figures that are taken into account is the yes, no, and abstain votes. But we also said we should look into the absences of countries. And all ASEAN diplomats I talked to were somewhat reluctant to comment on it, but what made things for us a bit suspicious is that when we looked into UN votings that covered the same topic, the same countries were absent, and they were absent on the same topics. And this must mean something, and we thought that this is perhaps a version of the super ASEAN way, because if you abstain and the others say no or say yes, you make sure that there is disagreement within the regional organization. But if you are not there, you still have an unanimous block voting picture, image, and that makes ASEAN look much better. But if we take these figures, then you see that the percentage of, perhaps you could show that, the percentage of joint and unanimous voting is much less impressive than if you leave out the absences. Again, this shows that there seems to be quite some disagreement once in a while about topics. The next slide also is very interesting because it shows to you, again under inclusion of the absences, which countries disagreed often or did not join the group, split from the group. And here you see that Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia have relatively high votes of, or very few instances of splitting from the ASEAN vote. More Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and interestingly the most the new members. I don't dare to say this has something to say about the cohesiveness, but I think this needs to be checked further. Final point here, compliance. ASEAN's compliance record is mixed. It's relatively good in the WTO because there are few challenges of ASEAN in the dispute settlement mechanism, much less than other regional organizations. It's less compliance, less impressive in the field of human rights or climate change. Finally, I would cover some of the strategies of ASEAN that we scrutinized. We thought that there are 5 major negotiation strategies. It's important that you get into executive and leadership position because you can then influence the negotiation process to a certain extent. We looked into how ASEAN as a collective unity framed its arguments in international organizations, especially in the UN, to what in what way ASEAN built coalitions in international organizations, to what extent it resorted to forum shopping if ASEAN felt that a certain forum does not really be beneficial for its interest. And third, we looked into the image projection and the creation of soft power, to what extent that is applied. Now, briefly summarizing this, we found a very ambiguous picture. For instance, in leadership positions, there were truly success stories of ASEAN where it really succeeded in bringing in some of its officials into very important positions in the UN. For instance, General Assembly, Rasali Ismail could be mentioned, or Supachai Panikpat in the WTO. There were less successful initiatives, like for instance for the UN General Secretary General, Surikyat Sathirathai, the former Thai foreign minister who failed, and other cases we looked into where ASEAN did not succeed. Just to summarize, we found that very often the cohesion of ASEAN is lacking. The support of candidates is lackluster. There's a decision, of course, that ASEAN will support a common candidate, but common candidates are often undermined by discussions that start after they have been nominated as the major candidate. Framing is also very interesting. ASEAN basically acts as a third world developmentalist regional organization. Millennium Development Goals and so on play a major role. But what we found interesting is that when ASEAN representatives speak in the UN General Assembly, very often they pursue a strategy that first they celebrate the achievements of their own country. Very rarely you have cases where explicitly it is referred to an ASEAN achievement. That appears very rarely. Coalition building is also a problem, especially in the WTA. ASEAN was a very cohesive entity during the Uruguay round, but not a cohesive entity at all during the Doha round. There's a lot of contradictory behavior due to the adherence to different coalitions, be it the Cairns Group, be it the G33, be it more with the developed countries like Singapore. So it is really a very difficult coordination within the Geneva circles. Forum home shopping is also practiced by ASEAN to a considerable extent, especially in the Asia Pacific. Should one follow international bodies like the IMF, or should one have an Asian Monetary Fund, the Chiang Mai? Yes, I'm almost to the Chiang Mai multilateralized, what is it? Initiative, for instance, are such cases, and ASEAN also played a major role as a creator of soft power through the conduct of international meetings which highlight ASEAN to the external world as an important player in the international field. So finally, to bring you back into that typology that I had, basically ASEAN operates more as a caucus than as a quasi-bloc. And finally, the conclusions, I think what the research has shown, there is no automatic and causal link between the progress of regional organization and increasing cohesion of regional organization. Regional organizations do extend, we corroborated this finding, their mode of intra-regional cooperation to global forums is very visible in the ASEAN case. ASEAN, the case of ASEAN suggests that the extension of cooperative behavior to global forums is not primarily a question of the institutional architecture. Ideational factors are truly important, and ASEAN foreign policy elites do share a basically skeptical worldview. That's also why I think these more ambiguous behavior in international organizations cannot be changed overnight. Insecurity and vulnerability are still aspects that are highly important, and therefore also the likelihood to have a more cohesive behavior is not really great. And finally, we found out in some additional case studies that we did that one factor that really has an impact of the cohesion of ASEAN is when really vital issues in the region are at stakes, like in the case of the Cambodia issue in the 1980s, or also in how to handle Burma more lately, then there seems to be a greater possibility that ASEAN acts cohesively. Thank you very much, and apologies for taking too much time.
Thank you very much, Professor Rueland. I now hand over to Andreas to disagree. Agree?
Thank you very much, Iva. Professor Juergen has given us a fantastic conceptual overview, seen from outside, looking at ASEAN. I will disappoint you now. I will give you a practitioner's view from somebody who lives in ASEAN and worked with ASEAN for the last 20 or so years. If I'm critical, you will take no offense, because when I see deficiencies or deficits in ASEAN's behavior, I do it and I say it because I want to see a stronger ASEAN. When I say I mean the EU. The question before us is ASEAN as an international actor, potential and constraints. Let me start with a value judgment. In terms of potential, I would give ASEAN 6 out of 10. And in terms of constraints, I would give ASEAN 4 out of 10. So it makes an average of 5. So you can say 5 out of 10, is the glass half full, half empty. I would say it's undecided because the future is open. You can say at one hand, and this is a practitioner's view, that we are currently, in many instances, stuck with where we are. And at the same time, ASEAN is working on its 2015 strategy, the post-2050 vision. Of course, I know about my own weaknesses, because you will say, is the EU in such a position, such a wonderful position of perfection, to lecture ASEAN? I'll leave the answer to you. So ASEAN is an unfinished, incomplete success story. And I would say the future depends essentially on ASEAN and the ASEANs and external partners, actors, can only help but cannot decide on behalf of ASEAN. And these external factors are hugely important at the same time because what we need to do from this realpolitik, reality check perspective that I promised you is to look at the wider picture. The aquarium is not empty in which ASEAN is swimming. The aquarium is rather big, and there are a few sharks out there, and stingrays, and golden carps. No, there are a few elephants in the room. You can see there's one elephant, that's China. You can say there are 2 elephants, China and the US. And you can say there are even a bit more. India, the EU, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea. This is the area which I would think is equally important as looking at ASEAN from a New York/Geneva angle. The question before us is, has ASEAN realized that a major power shift has happened over the last 2 decades in the region? Namely, that the 2 major elephants, China and the US, have moved their relationship. At the end of the Cold War is what was a quite pragmatic relationship of collaboration. And that has moved, shifted today into a relationship of collaboration and competition. The US pivot to Asia is both a reaction and a challenge to China's assertive behavior as a superpower, at least in the region, if not beyond. So when you look at the security situation, you would say there is, at the one hand, the traditional part, political, military security questions. ASEAN is not part of any of those problems. At the same time, ASEAN is not part of any solution to these problems. You take North Korea, you take the general arms build-up in the region, and this happens with or without ASEAN. On the other hand, you have non-traditional security issues, transborder criminality, terrorism, pandemics, tsunamis. Here, ASEAN is very much part of the problem because ASEAN has these problems, but ASEAN is also part of the solution where things do happen. I think of narratives where ASEAN took a lead. So that gives us 3 results, or intermediate results if you want. 1, US and China relations are crucial. There's no need to take sides. It's just to be aware and to make to articulate your position in that respect. The second intermediate result, I would say, is bilateral alliances, coalitions, marriages of convenience, bilateral ones, count more than regional or multilateral approaches. And the question is, how does that make ASEAN visible as a group? And the third intermediate result is, I would say, the question of a global player. What makes you a global player? The delivery of international public goods. The most important public good is clearly security. Is ASEAN ready to assume such a role, at least in the region? You can say, partly it has happened. Partly it has happened. Of course, I would like to see more. So this is an open-ended question, and we have to see what ASEAN is making out of it. Now, what shall we do? There is this post-2015 vision on which the high-level task force is currently working as we speak. And its basis is the famous Bali Concord 3. And I will now play, as I was asked by Rahimah to play the devil's advocate. The Bali Concord is only a partial answer because it's rather inward-looking. But you look at the three key elements that refer to the international role for ASEAN. You see there is talk about of a common voice, there's talk about more capacity, and there's talk about a stronger ASEAN Secretariat. Now, a common voice, yes, but to whom are you speaking? Or a more radical test question would be, who is afraid of ASEAN? Who is respectful of ASEAN? Who is liking ASEAN? Give us a thumbs up, who's liking ASEAN? More capacity, yes, sure, but to do what? This is why I think the ASEAN peacekeeping idea is a great idea, because that would exactly deliver on that point. The stronger ASEAN Secretariat, very much advocated, I wouldn't contradict, but it seems to be, if it stands alone as an answer, it's a typical answer of a bureaucrat. Let's do another layer of bureaucracy. And you assume that your stronger bureaucracy will then create what I would call the normative power of facts. That you have so much wisdom and knowledge assembled in the ASEAN Secretariat that the leaders just have to take that into consideration. And I would doubt that will happen if there's not a political will to do it. So the ASEAN Secretariat reform, fine, I'm all in favor, but it needs a bit more. Maybe the conceptual interpretation of ASEAN has a built-in flaw, because ASEAN is very pragmatic, and we come with our analytical wisdom always afterwards. Now, what are these constraints? You mentioned the value systems. Maybe that's an unfair question, because of this divergent, heterogeneous group of countries. Organizational structure, yes, clearly. This is one of the key weaknesses, we said that. But it's weak for a purpose, and you have rightly pointed out the Westphalian background. I would like to actually make a little footnote to that. Westphalia, for those who are not familiar, is at the end of a devastating war 400 years ago in Europe, where the idea of sovereignty was invented. I, as a ruler of that country, am not answerable to anybody outside. And that makes all countries equal. That leads them to this non-interference. Westphalia, yes, but it has been adapted here. So I would call it an Eastphalian model. What you have here, in a way, because it's the ASEAN way, where you do your dealings behind the scenes. This constrains clearly sovereignty, Westphalia/Eastphalia. Non-interference, the famous mantra, again one of those mantras under the cover of which you can do something. And the comfort level. The comfort level is the concept I like the least, I have to say, because when you challenge it, what does it mean? Comfort stands actually for interest. You just don't want to say the word interest because it sounds so selfish. Whereas if you say comfort, it sounds so altruistic. We should all be happy. But comfort for whom? A question that ASEAN should ask themselves, yeah? The ASEANs should ask themselves. Comfort for whom? For the government? For an administration to camouflage its inertia? is comfort always comfort, or does it change over time? And what happens if your interests are diverse within your own country? The government says A, like administration, B, like business, and C, like civil society. And they're all different. Who is then deciding what is your interest/comfort position? And the most important criticism that I have of that is that the idea of liberty, comfort level, no arm twisting, a little bit of pinching, but not arm twisting, that concept prevents you from finding optimal or technocratically researched good decisions. You have objectively, you have a set of options, of decisions that you are able to take. You can evaluate them. But in the ASEAN context, you don't do that. You say, well, we don't even look at them. We look at the comfort level of everybody. So, I mean, I'm all in favor of comfort level, but there is a built-in difficulty.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. 1.5. I don't want to sound overly negative. ASEAN is clearly an inward-looking success story. Outward-looking, as we said, unfinished business. Too little ASEAN for my taste. I want to see more ASEAN, but will depend on the political will of the 10 member states to coincide, to overlap, and to trickle down. The ASEAN is not very famous for a huge speed in implementing decisions. This is why they imitate the EU. The test questions would be these: how closer can you make administrations, the military machinery, not the ADMM, but the military machineries? How much trust? How many joint maneuvers can you do? How close can you make your foreign ministries? Is there a diplomatic exchange program, for instance, conceivable that we have in the EU between the Commission and member states? And how close to cooperate the intel services? Hugely important for trust building. Another concrete idea, as mentioned earlier, I think the ASEAN peace-building force, peacekeepers, would be a fantastic thing. And a coherent presentation at the General Assembly, we have heard that. I had also in my notes mentioning the common candidates, at least in areas where it's uncontested, that you agree on somebody. And only then you can look at agreeing on a more coherent, outward-looking position in really difficult issues like the South China Sea. I think I stop here, and thank you very much, and I'd like to expand in our discussion.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Now I pass it to Pat George. Now, you're not obliged to answer or comment, and you're allowed to represent the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also ASEAN. So I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Ibu Rahimah. Good afternoon, ambassadors and colleagues. I will be speaking as former Indonesian chair during the Indonesian chairmanship in ASEAN. I'll be speaking as the director for, of course, functional cooperation of ASEAN. How we see ASEAN, in fact, has to be from the understanding the background of ASEAN itself. As an association, ASEAN work together in order to achieve their goals. This is a very loose organization from the very beginning. And it has evolved in a manner it has to be suitable to each and every member of ASEAN. 10 member ASEAN. If -1 is not ASEAN, there is no ASEAN minus formula. That is why ASEAN is always consensus-based. If the question was whether we want to have ASEAN more rule-based, of course. We wanted it from the very beginning. But there is a magic word behind that. To the level, comfort to everybody. Why? We don't want to break the very thin layer between ASEAN member states in cooperating each other in order to achieve its goal. Do we have to compare ASEAN with EU? No. From the very beginning, we don't want to be EU. I always answer to the question if there's a comparison between ASEAN and EU. I said, if EU, 28 member country, as an eggs, 28 eggs smashed together into one. For ASEAN, 10 intact eggs put in one bowl. Nothing was smashed.
No.
Yeah, no omelette.
Boiled.
It will be boiled,
Boiled
hard-boiled egg. So there is a difference between how we see ASEAN and other regional organizations. Then now I will start to make perhaps comments on the presentation. Yeah. First is the ASEAN Secretariat. This is also a very, very tricky discussion we have in ASEAN. I saw familiar faces, yeah, during negotiation in ASEAN, whether we want ASEAN Secretariat to be very, very strong. No. Whether we want ASEAN Secretariat to be sufficiently strong. Yes. To serve the member states. Because ASEAN, as a sovereign member, 10 sovereign member states, doesn't want to be dictated by the Secretariat. No. 10 member states is the master. So you follow what the master says. Maybe this is very blunt, undiplomatic way of expressing that. But I think people have to understand that. Otherwise, people will circling around and say, you have to be strong, of course, but sufficiently enough. Because we don't want ASEAN Secretariat later on dictated on the agenda. Yeah? Negotiation. I know the behavior of Southeast Asian diplomats sometimes are very, very shy people. Yeah, except perhaps Indonesian. But if you see the reality, in fact, they are using their cultural background in order to pursue what they want. So they will find ways on negotiating every goal that they needed or they want to be successful. That is the ASEAN way, pursuing things without creating damage. ASEAN are very careful. People in ASEAN are very careful people, I believe. Even though as a family, mind you, the 10 member states, if we have a discussion in CPR, yeah, in working group, we are really, really very, very hard. We are really, really up into the bones of the discussion, of the matter that we are discussing. The next question was the norm entrepreneur. Perhaps ASEAN now is already creating a new norms. Yeah? Being a very loose organization, but being a very successful organization. Being an organization that I think everybody is curious about how ASEAN works. Because people will not, I think, believe that ASEAN could be as successful as now. Because it was very loose. But then the loose circumstances that we have, and agreeing on limited or perhaps not everything, are the magic words into moving forward step by steps. The voting and decision making in a global forum. I'm sorry, but voting is unrecognized in ASEAN. And you could not pursue that. Even though there is already some circumstances we want, perhaps in some issues, perhaps we have to really make sure who is agree or who is not in agreement with us. But still, consensus is the base of ASEAN to move forward. The question of ASEAN splitting their position in UNGA, it has been from, I think, long. When I was in New York, the way ASEAN member states tried to find solution in their position was in the G77 plus China. Mind you, there is China there. There is always a caucus Yeah, some of us are member of OIC. So we will find every venue to have an understanding. But try to push ourselves into a consensus on the ASEAN position that will depend on what we already agree in ASEAN meetings. We will, certainly. And we have, but there is a but. It has to be through a very strict mechanism in order not to find difficult situation in the future. The compliance, you know, ASEAN member states are well known with compliance. So in the WTO, everyone will just do their part, will faithfully follow steps, procedure, or term of reference that has been agreed upon. Now, perhaps from what Pak Andreas List mentioned, yeah, we understand very well that in ASEAN there is a big player, yeah, who always want to be in part of our decision making, who always to be part on whatever we do, yeah. Our neighbor, big neighbor China, our big neighbor India, yeah, US is also in a very close dialogue with us, so is EU. But our goal is to have what we want without making a big fuss with all the power. That's ASEAN way. It's very strange perhaps. We don't want to be known as somebody who are very big, too big, yeah, or small or too small. No, we just want to be ourselves. That's it. We are friends with everyone. We make friends with India, with China, with EU, with US, on the basis to serve the interests of the people. It sounds very cliche perhaps, but that is the goal of ASEAN, and that is what we discuss in our meetings. In so many meetings that we always said we have to streamline. You know, that is our challenge. Whether ASEAN is feasible as a group, many people perhaps will not admit that we are feasible. We don't having to state it that we are feasible. But in reality, we are very feasible. Whether we are feasible in our statements as a group, no, of course, no. Because that is also depends on the instruction, the formulation of our policy, and why we are in the process, perhaps. When we're not going to push it into 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, no. Let it be a process until we are ready to have one statement as a group of ASEAN. Organizational structure, yeah, that's I agree. Adjustment have to be done in our organizational structure to serve the purpose of member states. But this is also depend on our resources. You know, ASEAN always put a limited budget on everything. Why? Because we want to be accountable, we want to be efficient, we want to be transparent. So we do it step by step. And we always believe there is a process that we have to go through. We don't want to rush on anything. But comfort level, this is also a word that perhaps for everyone, it's a laughing stock. But we have to go in according with every comfort level. Indonesia perhaps sometimes have a very, very big or very high goal. But we have to adjust with other ASEAN members in order to have a harmony. This is also another word that sometimes people ask why harmony. But that's the reality. And one thing, I think if ASEAN peacekeeping is already been materialized, there could be a showcase. Let's wish until the ministerial level, until the SOM level, until the working group level discuss, and we wait. That because we know ASEAN way. One thing before I close, I think there is one thing I have to say. In ASEAN, everything is beautiful or are beautiful in its own time. So let's see. Thank you.
A true diplomat. Thank you very much, by George. And now we open the floor to discussion, questions and hopefully answers. I would like to recognize that we also have here Her Excellency Ambassador Stephanie Lee, who's, yes, and of course, Ambassador Nazardin Nasution, very senior and very good friend of the Habibie Center. And then we're very happy to see you. But yes, please, Ibrahim, please raise your hand. Ibrahim will give you a microphone, and then we can start the discussions. Pak Nazardin, and then yeah.
Thank you very much for a very excellent presentation from the three speakers for this afternoon. My name is Nazar Nasution. I am a Thai ambassador, now a lecturer of international relations at some university in Jakarta. Talking about ASEAN, I think never ending, because there are so many complexities of ASEAN. But of course, I would like to say that we would like to get some experience from the European Union to overcome the problems of what we call it now, because ASEAN is now approaching what we call it ASEAN community. There are three pillars of ASEAN community: political, security, economic, and social cultural. We understand that ASEAN consists of ASEAN 6 and ASEAN 4. ASEAN 6 is the 5 plus Brunei, Darussalam, and ASEAN 4 is CLMV, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. There are gap between the ASEAN 6 and the ASEAN 4 in terms of socio-economics. However, I have been posted in one of the countries in CLMV, and I understand that they now try hard to expedite the economic development, such as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Indonesia. And of course, they would like to get the benefits of the ASEAN community for their own, for the 4 CLMV. And talking about this ASEAN economic community, of course, comparing to, I would like not to make a comparison between ASEAN with the European Union, because we have different suprastructure. You have European Bank Central, you have also European Parliament and others. But we'd like to get the experience of the European Union. So I get both from you, the speakers, how far we have to narrowing the gaps of economic between some countries in the region to make closer to attainment of this community, particularly the ASEAN economic community. Because now we count days, count months for the end of 2015. And of course, we understand that there are so many former socialist countries join the European Union. And we understand also that some of those countries also, in terms of economic, are left behind comparing to the original members of the European Union. So we'd like to get some ideas from you, how far you see the... Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nasution. The lady in the yellow scarf, and then Alex.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Sophia. I have to say this is a very interesting forum for me because I represent AIPA, ASEAN Interparliamentary Assembly. If I may, I would like to explain the background of our organization because it has relation to my queries. We are a regional parliamentary organization of the 10 parliaments of ASEAN member states. So we cater services to those parliaments. Not many know about AIPA compared to our sibling ASEAN, but actually the sole reasons of our existence is ASEAN, and our primary goal, one of our primary goals is the harmonization of laws among the ASEAN member states. That's how we have, for example, annual General Assembly where we table resolutions and we adopt the resolutions with an expectation that it will be translated into national laws of the ASEAN member states. Having explained that, this is a very junior level kind of questions, but having explained that, what do you think IPA as a regional parliamentary can do to support ASEAN's goals? And if ASEAN were to revert to IPA as a supporting body in order to achieve its vision, its goals, will there be any constraints? One of the characteristics of IPA that actually we're trying to deal with that currently is that our resolutions, although agreed by all of the 10 IPA member parliaments, is not legally binding. So countries it's very optional for countries whether they would like to interpret or adopt it into national laws or not. So what do you think IPA can do to support ASEAN in achieving its goals? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Alex?
Thank you, Ima. Gentlemen, thank you for very good presentations. I really enjoyed it. I have a couple of questions, perhaps from the conceptual standpoint, Professor Rueland. It seems that a lot of the assessment that you have made very much focused on the state actors. I'm just wondering whether it is also worth examining the whole, the whole measurement about ASEAN's role as international actors from the non-state actors' standpoint. Do they actually play also a significant role as much as the state actors? I mean, one also might want to think about, to take into account the fact that sometimes, most of the time, not to offend you, Pak George, it's just that sometimes ASEAN diplomats are also, to me, being frankly, is a bit too conservative compared to their non-state, non-state counterparts. I think again, I mean, you mentioned about Pak George. You mentioned about the fact that ASEAN Secretariat is supposed to be there to serve the member states. But I think now we are already entering into the 21st century, and there is now a shifting demand. I don't think people are now talking about ASEAN as a, that kind of, I mean, like, of course, this is what the ASEAN want to portray itself, but I think the demands from the society is changing quite significantly. I don't think, I think there needs to be a way for ASEAN to rethink of its, role and function, also in relation to ASEAN Secretariat. I think it is no longer that, there is a lot of push actually from the civil society, from the business organization to see ASEAN as an integrated community. So I don't think we are actually very passionate to see a very slow integration in ASEAN. So and then back to Professor Rueland. Second question, sir. I mean, you said a lot about like, okay, ASEAN is not doing quite well, more or less, as an international actors, a bit ineffective. So what's the way forward then? What would you suggest? Thank you.
Right, I'm going to take these questions first, and then we'll do a second round. So I'll let Professor Rueland answer some of them first, and then of course Andreas and George, and by George.
Okay, choose some of the questions. Start with the last one, Alex. Yeah, I mean, this is really a problem. What we propose is nothing spectacular, because we feel that the cognitive structure of decision makers is such that, as Pak George said, there cannot be expected too far-reaching, too spectacular steps in the beginning. And if already the strengthening of the Secretariat is something that is contested among ASEAN members, I do not see really too much space for improving this performance in some of the international organizations within a short time. Probably, and we discussed that before, usually a major change always takes place, and I'm saying that with hesitation, if there is some sort of a crisis or external shock. The ASEAN financial crisis, for instance, has strongly affected the way ASEAN looked at internal and external things. And I don't think that as things stand now, there will be a major change within a short time. What we proposed was making the Secretariat more efficient in the sense that it is a catalyst, a knowledge manager, that it provides know-how to the respective governments, especially to the weaker ones. But I see very well the point that Pajot has mentioned. This is a principal-agent problem. If the principals do not agree to that, and if they are afraid that the agent, in that case the Secretariat, would develop certain competences of its own, then this does not fly. So this might not be a satisfactory answer, but for the time being, there are no spectacular steps to be expected. The second thing, state actors versus civil society actors. I think this is an important point, and we address this in our research very prominently. We always ask in our interviews, for instance, if you build up a position on, I don't know, human rights or climate change, or where NGOs are very vocal, to what extent do you also prepare your negotiation standpoint with NGOs or non-state actors? And there it seems that despite several noteworthy changes in the area of ASEAN itself, there's still a major reluctance from the part of diplomats and official representatives to interact with NGOs. Also, if you look at an issue that probably is of interest to Indonesia, because Indonesia in the last couple of years always said that its internal change of the political system, the democratization, should also be part of its foreign policy, that democracy should be a major element of it. Yes, you could see that at the level of international organizations to some extent, as Indonesia strongly promotes a more equal playing field in international organizations, so democratizing the executive multilateralism, if you wish. But it does not say much about to what extent, for instance, the UN should be parliamentarized, or it does not say much about what kind of interaction with civil society organizations should play. This is not a major topic, and I know also from many other conversations outside Indonesia that this is not something that is agreeable to other ASEAN partners. And finally, IPA, yes, IPA is very interesting. I did 2 studies about IPA, and I find the problem is that, again, like the Secretariat, IPA is an entity, as you said, which is not officially part of ASEAN, and it has virtually no competences. It had recommendatory powers, but that's it. And also, if you look at the composition of ASEAN, it's not really representative. Indonesia sends its MPs into the General Assembly, which more or less reflect the party structure. But this is not done in many other countries. There it's the government that also appears in the IPA assembly. So the problem is that it has neither legislative powers, neither powers of oversight, nor it is very representative. And a colleague of mine had made a very nice sort of typology how such transnational parliaments could look like, and she distinguished real parliaments, which should have all these competences that I mentioned. Then she spoke of assemblies where you have lesser powers, and she spoke of conferences which have no power, and IPA still is at that level. And IPA, by the way, is supporting ASEAN very much. To my feeling, much too much, because a parliament should be an oversight agency in some way. And if you look at the resolutions of IPA, very much you find statements like we welcome the decision of the leaders who have said this and that. I think this is probably what does not so much help ASEAN. I think there should be a more critical stance on the part of the legislators. I stop here.
Thank you. I would like to pick up what Professor Juergen said about IPA. I would extend that and extrapolate into the future. I would expect over time, as ASEAN develops politically and economically, that you will see probably a stronger call for, I don't say democracy, but I say a call for more transparent governance. And that might translate into a stronger role of IPA. It is not for now, because as we have just heard, there's some resistance from some quarters, but over time I think this is a trend to watch. And good policies, I would think, is something that you see coming, and you take it up and give it your spin, and you don't wait until this trend comes, it becomes a political tsunami. On Mr. Sutjon's question, your question was narrowing the gap. Is it necessary, or how much of that is necessary to be a stronger voice on the international scene? I would say there is no such evident link. So you can have in the EU a weaker, say, Bulgaria or currently Greece, and still, as long as you have this coherent Brussels decision-making mechanism with a sound element of solidarity, you impact still to the same level. That said, there is an interest to narrow the gap between the 6 and the 4, obviously, as we have the same interest with the EU. The EU has found a quite simple, straightforward formula, which is easy to understand. It's way more difficult to be put in practice, but it's one of the most successful instruments. It's called regional policy. If you do it, and I come back to how it works in a second, if you do it, you create such internal cohesiveness that it positively impacts on your external projection. How does it work? In simple terms, you take a big Excel table and you break down the 28 member states into, let's say, 300 regions. That's why it's called regional policy. And then you measure these regions across the board with dozens and dozens and hundreds of parameters. How many asphalt roads per percentage of all roads? How many gynecologists per 100,000 inhabitants? How many secondary schools? How many universities? And hundreds of parameters. And then you get a sort of a median value of 100, and then you get a lower value of 75%, provinces that achieve only 75% of that development. And then you apply your regional policy. You say, if you are between the 100, the average, and the 75, the low average, you get financial support for these and these areas, like road infrastructure, medical infrastructure, health, education, whatever. If you're below the 75%, you get almost unlimited support for everything because you need to catch up. I remember when we went as a family to Ireland some years ago, we were driving across country and my children were sitting in the back and they are convinced Europeans because of their father, of course, and they said, look, Daddy, there's another sign, a billboard that says, this bridge has been funded by the EU, and another road, and another toll road, another tunnel, and every time there was an EU sign, funded by EU regional policy. And at one point there was no such sign, and my daughter said, Daddy, what's wrong with this bridge? It is to say that that creates a certain intra-EU solidarity that impacts positively on the external image.
But then they have rejected the constitutional treaty.
Well, let me ask them to vote again. Yeah? So this would be my answer. Regional policy is not necessarily a precondition for external impact, but it helps create a critical mass of solidarity.
Thank you. I'll start with Alex. I have to admit, that perhaps now the ASEAN diplomats have to be conservative. Let's change it. How? It will depend on the civil society. And it will depend on each and every one of us. Because Indonesia alone could not do that. Or Singaporean alone, or Vietnamian alone, or the Philippines alone. Let's have a discussion on that and agree on that. However, if we discuss about the process in finding a solution in ASEAN, for me, the most important thing is not the ASEAN Secretariat itself, but the entities related to ASEAN. Then find the loopholes on how we can make use of the entities related to ASEAN for the better policy. Like for an example, ABAC, yeah? ABAC is also, I think, a very open. You have played your role well, but whether it is sufficient, I'll leave it to you. So if you think you can make ASEAN much better with the entities related to ASEAN, let's do it together. You know, in fact, ASEAN member states are very open-minded people. But some circumstances have to be abide by the rule and regulation that we already agreed upon. And it has been taken for some years. So let's do the involvement. Yeah, that will be the challenge, I think. Yeah. So then, if we have to be, I think, honest to ourselves, whether the integration process is very slow. You know, many people keep on asking me this, but many people do not realize. Like for example, the AFTA, for how many years already exists? People now start coming back again and say, let's welcome AFTA and BIMEA. No, it's not true. AFTA is already here, more than 10 years. Yeah?
No, 92.
92.
Yeah. So, now about IPA. I think first thing, and the most important thing, please ask the leaders, so the IPA member can ask the leaders to review their mandate. For us, it's very simple. It will depend on the mandates given to IPA, whether they are a recommendatory function, whether it is a legally binding function that have to be played in the future, do it. So IPA can come to the leaders or through the Minister for Foreign Affairs meetings and state that we want to have this mandate. Or we can perhaps, or IPA can perhaps try to find channel, yeah, and ask for review. I think there will be another solution. Perhaps it's not as big or as wide as you requested, but there will be a way in increasing the, the role of IPA in the future. And I think from the very beginning also the existing of IPA was not very smooth. That's why it has to be a steps taken. So let's agree on trying to review the mandate, ask our Cambodian colleagues who are sitting behind that, whether ASEAN member states also could agree on that, yeah? And perhaps a little bit on the ASEAN community part. It's a process. For Indonesia, 31st of December 2015 is not immediately ASEAN community will come into perfection. It's not a one-time event, but it's a process. So let's agree on having started from 31st of December 2015 as the ASEAN community be established, but then we work together into a perfection of ASEAN community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll open the round for second round of questions. In the back.
Thank you. My name is Anna. My question is, speaking about food stability in Indonesia as basic need, the constraint is the high price of fertilizer and seed. And farmer poor and move to town to find another job. My question is, what's the role of ASEAN countries to accomplish the plan of food stability? Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Questions?
Only one question? I was in fact trying to find the answer first.
Oh.
No, but anyway, food stability, food security perhaps, is the usual term that we use. Food security is a very, very important issue that has been always discussed up to the ministerial and to the leaders level. And we help each other in try to find solution in each and every problem arises related to the food security matters. So if there is a fertilizer problem in Indonesia, usually we discuss with our friends from Vietnam, Thailand. If there is a problem with rice, for example, we discuss with Vietnam, Thailand. So it depends on which aspect is that we have. In the context of ASEAN, yeah. So the issue related to food security, an issue that is very dear to ASEAN, it go up to the leaders level in every matters. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Rahim.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers. I found this very interesting. Stephanie Lee, the New Zealand ambassador to ASEAN. I've spent a lot of my life in the multilateral world, New York, Paris with the OECD, climate change, and I've been very interested to see how different countries and different regional groups play out their objectives and their strategies. And it's true, I think, where I've been, that I haven't necessarily seen ASEAN as a particularly strong group, although I have often seen strong voices from ASEAN countries. But one of the groups that I have seen act very strongly, also a regional organisation, or perhaps a regional organisation -2, is the Pacific, and particularly with the Pacific Islands Forum. Now the forum includes Australia and New Zealand, and we tend sometimes to act together internationally, for example in New York. But these small island states of the Pacific do seem to have a remarkable degree of cohesion and a remarkable international voice. They're highly influential, for example, in climate change, and yet they are very diverse. They're incredibly spread out. They're very low capacity, by and large, very diverse. They don't really have the same interests, but they can really pull together. Have you done any sort of thinking about how an organisation, a regional organisation like that, might have lessons for, or might just be totally different from ASEAN, and what that might mean?
Yeah, I think it's a very valid question. In our research, we did a classical case study, but that was the job we had to do. And of course, you're right, comparative study would have provided much more insights, and I can promise you this is part of my next studies that I. But the answer would of course come much later. But this is really something one has to look into, and also a colleague of mine in Freiburg is doing this kind of work, looking into the capacities of regional organizations from a comparative point of view. And at least one of the preliminary results is that indeed regional organizations are more vocal in international organizations than they have been before. There's a greater tendency to be an actor in its own right, more or less, even now not being supra-national at that point, but acting more cohesively. But there's also a but. The problem is this can be observed mostly in low politics issues, minor issues where not so much is at stake and where you can agree quickly. But I take your suggestion serious and look more closely into the Southern Pacific Forum. I think that's a really good proposal to do that.
I told you you'd get your next idea from this. But while we wait for other questions, Professor Rueland, can you tell us about your the current one on Indonesia's foreign policy, the research that you're doing? A little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, that was another study that has been completed more or less, and the manuscript is ready, that basically deals with Indonesian foreign policy identities and how Indonesian stakeholders view Southeast Asian regionalism, what ideas they have. Because, as you know, after the end of the new order, there was also a substantial opening of the foreign policy process, in the sense that it was recognized even by law. The foreign policy law states that there are more stakeholders than only the government sector. And so I looked into what is coming on from below, and the major example I took was the debate in Indonesia of the ASEAN Charter. That's now several years ago already, but this really crystallized the thinking of many stakeholders about what role Indonesia should play regionally and even globally. And the stakeholders I looked into were apart from the government sector, legislators, the DPR, the academe, of course, as well, the press, the business sector, and NGOs. But it is difficult to summarize the results in a nutshell, because the views were quite diverse. But what was very interesting is, and that perhaps also gives some additional answer to the question of the ambassador. After the Asian financial crisis, there was a complete rethinking, overhaul of ASEAN modalities to some extent. To such an extent that some people started talking about the Europeanization of ASEAN, in the sense that a lot of institutional terminology was taken over from ASEAN. If you read the ASEAN Charter, you find lots of institutions that sound very similar in European ears. The Committee of Permanent Representatives was just mentioned a while ago, would be one example, 3 pillars, and so on and so on. But I rejected the idea, as some people said, that ASEAN is becoming more similar to the EU, and that the EU is the gold standard of regional organization, and everybody is imitating the lead model, so to speak. I rejected that idea, and I showed in this research that through the discussion in Indonesia, among Indonesian stakeholders, a lot of inputs and ideas of the EU were taken into account, but localized. They were reconstructed the ASEAN way. And those people who say that ASEAN is taking over EU norms and is becoming increasingly similar really do a lot of or ignore this kind of localization that is taking place. ASEAN had adjusted that inputs to their own ideas. That's basically what it is about.
Well, very interesting, and if you're interested in that, watch this space, and we'll make sure if it gets launched here, we'll try to prod Ministry of Foreign Affairs to host that too. So any other questions? Otherwise, I'll hand back to the Professor. Any final words? No? Andreas? Or George? No final words? Okay, then, final words from me. Well, again, discussions like this make us definitely realize that there's still a lot that needs to be done. And I think, Alex, thank you for pointing out that the non-state actors' point of view. Alex Chandra, the Executive Director of ASEAN Business Advisory Council, who has just been challenged by Juergen. So there you go. Maybe we'll have you on the panel next. But in any case, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And again, a lot of, like Andreas said, a lot of the critique we take, of course, because we want ASEAN to grow. And then and a strong ASEAN Secretariat, significantly strong enough, sorry, not strong, significantly strong enough ASEAN Secretariat is what we want. But it's something that we continue to support, and we will continue to push for these changes and improvements and greater ASEAN, which is why we have, and again, Ambassador Nazar Nasution said just now, there's a lot of things that we discuss about this. ASEAN is greatly discussed. That is why we have Talking ASEAN. So thank you very much for attending. I'd like to make a few announcements for you to note down if you're interested to come to several of our other programs. We have a pretty packed calendar this month. Next week on the 25th in the morning, we have a launch of our National Violence Monitoring System research, part of our National Violence Monitoring System research on democracy and post-conflict regions and peaceful development. That will be in, but that won't be here. It will be in JS Luansa. Please contact my colleagues for more information. But in the afternoon, there will be a lecture here. We have a professor of communication from Russia that will be talking about media role in 21st century Russia. So if you're interested in that, please also let Ibrahim or Juergen know if you're interested in that. Yeah. But in any case, and then on the 30th, again, we have, and I'm sure we'll have someone from Andreas's office again on the panel, if not Andreas, on EU-ASEAN cooperation in security and non-security and non-traditional security. Dr. Felix Hajduk will be here. So, so if you're interested in any of our future events, please make sure that you jot down your email address and that we have it. We also publish and distribute a weekly ASEAN roundup of news on ASEAN, about ASEAN that are relevant. And all the materials and summary of this discussion will also be put together and distributed. So if you'd like to be on that mailing list, please let us know. So with that, I thank you very much again. Thank you, Professor Rueland and Andreas and George. A round of applause for a fabulous and a safe journey home. Thank you very much. Thank you. I enjoyed that. I'm so looking forward to getting the book in my hand and reading it now. So, I don't have any questions when you look at it.